Viking Berserkers, myth versus reality, fury unleashed. The very word berserker conjures images that have haunted the human imagination for over 1,000 years. Picture this: a massive warrior, shirtless or clad in a bearskin, howling at the moon. His eyes are rolling back in his head. He bites the edge of his shield until splinters fly from his teeth. He ignores swords piercing his chest, arrows sprouting from his shoulders, axes buried in his skull. He feels no pain. He knows no fear. He is a human whirlwind of destruction, frothing at the mouth, killing friend and foe alike until the battle frenzy finally releases him and he collapses exhausted, sometimes dead, sometimes simply broken. This is the berserker of legend. This is the warrior so feared that entire armies would flee before the battle even began. But here's the question that has puzzled historians for centuries. Is any of it true? Did these madmen really exist? Could a human being actually fight in a trance-like state, immune to pain and fear? Or is the berserker just a myth? A scary story that Vikings told to terrify their enemies, a legend that grew with every retelling across 1,000 years. Today, we are going to separate the bone-crushing reality from the wild fantasy. We will dive into the sagas, the archaeological evidence, the modern neuroscience, and even the dark secrets of hallucinogenic mushrooms. By the time we finish, you will never look at a Viking the same way again, because the truth about berserkers is far stranger, far darker, and far more terrifying than any myth. Let's start with the myths. The stories that have become pop culture gospel. Most people believe that berserkers were simply Viking special forces, elite shock troops who worked themselves into a rage before battle. The sagas, those medieval Icelandic stories written down centuries after the Viking Age, are full of berserker tales. One famous saga describes a berserker named Egil, who would get so angry that his eyebrows drooped, his face turned red as blood, and he began to chew on his cloak. Another saga tells of warriors who howled like wolves, grew as strong as bears, and could not be stopped by fire or iron. The word berserker itself is usually translated as bear shirt, bear for bear, serker for shirt. So a berserker was literally a warrior who wore a bearskin cloak. Some sources also mention Alfhednar, wolf-coated warriors who wore wolfskins instead. So far, so legendary. But here is where the myth starts to crack. The sagas were written down in the 13th and 14th centuries, hundreds of years after the main Viking Age ended. They are not history. They are epic poetry, family drama, and supernatural fantasy all mixed together. The berserkers in the sagas do impossible things. They fight supernatural creatures. They survive wounds that would kill 10 normal men. In one story, a berserker named Armod fights while his head is cut in half by an axe. He keeps fighting for several minutes before collapsing. That is not a historical record. That is horror fiction. So if we rely only on the sagas, we might conclude that berserkers are pure fantasy, like Greek cyclopes or Norse trolls. But then we find the archaeological evidence, and the evidence changes everything. The real proof that berserkers existed comes from small silver objects found all over Scandinavia, tiny pendants, amulets and brooches dating to the 8th and 9th centuries. And what do these amulets show? Warriors wearing bear masks, warriors in animal skins holding spears, their mouths open in what looks like a howl or a scream. These are not generic Viking images. These are specific depictions of a specific type of warrior. Then we have the written sources from outside Scandinavia, sources that were written during the Viking Age, not centuries later. The Arab traveller Ibn Fadlan, who met Vikings along the Volga River in the year 922, described something remarkable. He wrote about a group of Viking warriors who wore animal skins and worked themselves into a frenzy before battle. He said they growled like dogs, bit their shields, and seemed to feel no pain. He said they were like mad dogs, utterly without fear. Ibn Fadlan had no reason to lie. He was an educated Muslim diplomat who was honestly reporting what he saw. So berserkers were real. But the question remains, what was actually happening inside their bodies and minds? How could a human being fight without feeling pain, without fear, with seemingly superhuman strength? The answer lies not in magic, but in biology, psychology, and chemistry. And there are three competing theories that historians and scientists argue about to this day. Theory number one: self-induced psychological trance. This theory says that berserkers were masters of a specific mental technique. They would work themselves into a dissociative state through ritualized actions, chanting, dancing, rhythmic breathing, biting their shields, howling. This is not magic. This is neuroscience. The human brain, under extreme stress or ritualized preparation, can enter a state called dissociative trance. In this state, the brain's fear centers, the amygdala, are suppressed. Pain signals are still sent by the body, but the brain ignores them. Adrenaline floods the system. The body's natural painkillers, endorphins, are released in massive quantities. A man in this state can break bones without noticing. He can fight with a sword buried in his shoulder. He can keep killing even as he bleeds to death. We know this state exists because we have modern examples. Firefighters who run into burning buildings without protective gear. Soldiers who continue fighting after being shot multiple times. Mothers who lift cars off their children. The berserker trance is just an extreme, ritualized version of the same biological response. It is not supernatural, but it is terrifying. The second piece of evidence for this theory is the berserker's behavior after the battle. The sagas say that after the frenzy passed, berserkers were weak as children. They would shake uncontrollably. They would sleep for an entire day. They were emotionally numb, sometimes unable to speak. That is exactly what happens after a massive adrenaline and endorphin crash. The body is depleted. The nervous system is fried. So theory one is plausible, but theory two is even darker. Theory number two: hallucinogenic drugs. This is the theory that everyone loves because it involves magic mushrooms. Specifically, a mushroom called Amanita muscaria, the fly agaric. That's the red mushroom with white spots that you see in Super Mario games. Amanita muscaria grows all over Scandinavia, and it is a powerful hallucinogen. It can cause euphoria, dissociation, time distortion, and a feeling of superhuman strength. It can also cause aggression, confusion, and a blank, staring expression. Exactly how berserkers are described. The fly agaric theory is popular. It appears in dozens of documentaries and YouTube videos. There's just one problem. No historical source, not a single saga, not a single runestone, not a single Arab account mentions Vikings eating mushrooms before battle. Zero. Zilch. None. That doesn't mean they didn't. It just means we have no evidence. There is another plant, though, that is mentioned: henbane. Henbane is a poisonous plant in the nightshade family. It contains scopolamine and hyoscyamine, drugs that cause delirium, hallucinations, and a complete loss of fear. Unlike the fly agaric, henbane is actually mentioned in Viking sources. Archaeologists have found henbane seeds near Viking settlements, and here's the kicker: henbane causes a blank, staring expression, dilated pupils, and a tendency to bite and chew on things, just like berserkers. The downside: henbane is deadly in high doses, and the line between frenzied warrior and dead from poisoning is very thin. So theory 2 is possible, but it remains speculation. And that brings us to theory 3, which is the most disturbing of all. Theory number 3, genetic and pathological rage. Some historians believe that berserkers were not normal men who entered trances or took drugs. They believe berserkers were men with actual brain disorders. Conditions like temporal lobe epilepsy can cause sudden, explosive rage. People with this condition can have ictal fury, episodes of unprovoked violence during which they feel no pain, no fear, and have no memory of their actions afterwards. During these episodes, they may bite, howl, and attack anything in front of them. Sound familiar? Other possible conditions include intermittent explosive disorder, psychopathy, and even a genetic mutation that affects adrenaline regulation. There is a famous case from the 20th century, a Finnish lumberjack who would go into sudden rages, chop down trees with his bare hands, and then collapse with no memory of what happened. His condition was eventually diagnosed as a rare form of epilepsy. Could berserkers have been men with these disorders who were then ritualized and weaponized by Viking war bands? It is possible, but here's the problem with theory 3. If berserkers were simply mentally ill, they would not have been elite warriors. They would have been dangerous liabilities who killed their own side. And the sagas actually confirm this. In many stories, berserkers are not heroes, they are outcasts, they are criminals. They are men so dangerous that they cannot live in normal society. In one saga, a group of berserkers goes from farm to farm, challenging farmers to duels, taking their land and raping their women. They are eventually hunted down and killed by the hero. So the historical truth might be that berserkers were a combination of all three theories. Some were warriors who trained themselves into trances. Some used drugs, some were mentally unstable, and some were simply legends. Stories told to frighten children and enemies alike. But here is where the myth and reality collide in the most fascinating way. Even if berserkers were real, they were not common. The vast majority of Viking warriors were farmers, traders, and fishermen who picked up axes when they needed to raid. They fought in shield walls. They used tactics. They felt fear, pain, and exhaustion, like any normal human. The berserker was the exception, the outlier, the nightmare that the Vikings themselves feared. And that is the key to understanding the myth. The berserkers were not just weapons against enemies, they were psychological weapons. Imagine you are an Anglo-Saxon monk in 793 AD. The first Viking ships have just landed at Lindisfarne. You see warriors jumping from the boats, but among them are men wearing bearskins. They are howling, they are biting their shields. They are staring at you with eyes that seem to glow. One of them is stabbed by your guard. He does not fall, he does not scream. He pulls the spear from his chest and keeps coming. What do? You run, and you never look back. That is the power of the berserker myth. It does not matter if the trance was real. It does not matter if the immunity to pain was only temporary. What matters is that the enemy believed, and belief on a medieval battlefield was a weapon sharper than any sword. Now let's talk about the darker side of the berserker legend, the side that the sagas and the video games do not show you. In Viking society, berserkers were eventually outlawed. By the 11th century, Norway and Iceland passed laws specifically banning berserker behavior. Why? Because berserkers were a threat to everyone, not just enemies. In peacetime, they would challenge innocent men to duels. They would demand payment to go away. They would rape, murder, and pillage their own people. The Viking kings, who were trying to build stable kingdoms, not endless chaos, saw berserkers as a cancer. One of the most famous Icelandic sagas, the Saga of the Volsungs, describes a berserker named Sigmund who wears a wolf skin and fights like a madman. But by the end of the saga, Sigmund is dead, and the message is clear: the wild, uncontrolled fury of the berserker belongs to the old pagan age. The new Christian civilized age has no place for men who bite shields and howl at the moon. So by the year 1100, berserkers had vanished from history. They existed only in stories, but stories, as we know, never truly die. The modern obsession with berserkers began in the 19th century during the Romantic era. European artists and writers, tired of industrial civilization, looked back at the Vikings as noble savages. They imagined berserkers as heroic freedom fighters, wild men who rejected society and embraced nature. The German composer Richard Wagner wrote operas about Viking heroes. The British poet Thomas Gray wrote a poem called The Descent of Odin, which featured a berserker raging across the battlefield. And in the 20th century, the Nazis twisted the berserker image for their own evil purposes. They called their elite troops stormtroopers, a direct echo of the berserker frenzy. They saw berserkers as the ultimate Aryan warrior, pure, fearless, and merciless. This is a dark chapter in the berserker's history, but it explains why many modern scholars are cautious about celebrating berserkers too much. The line between fearsome warrior and mindless killer is thinner than we think. So where does that leave us today? What is the final verdict on the Viking berserker? Myth, reality, or something in between? Here is the consensus among modern historians. Yes, berserkers were real. They existed as a distinct class of warrior in Scandinavia between roughly 750 AD and 1050 AD. They wore animal skins, usually bear or wolf. They worked themselves into a state of battle frenzy before combat. That frenzy was likely a combination of ritualized psychological techniques, possibly aided by drugs like henbane. During the frenzy, they experienced reduced pain sensitivity, increased aggression, and a trance-like state. After the frenzy, they collapsed in exhaustion. They were feared by enemies and respected by their own side, but also feared and eventually outlawed by Viking kings. The supernatural elements, immunity to fire and iron, shape-shifting into actual bears, fighting with their heads cut in half, are pure myth. Those stories were added centuries later by Christian monks who wanted to make the pagan past seem monstrous and magical. So the real berserker was terrifying enough without the fantasy. A man who cannot feel pain is terrifying. A man who feels no fear is terrifying. A man who might be your friend one moment and your murderer the next. That is the stuff of nightmares. And here is the most important thing to remember. The berserker is not a role model. He is not a hero to emulate. The berserker represents the darkest part of human nature, the part that wants to destroy without reason, that finds joy in violence, that surrenders all control to raw animal fury. The Vikings themselves understood this. They told stories of berserkers not to celebrate them, but to warn against them. The greatest Viking heroes, men like Ragnar Lothbrok and Harald Fairhair, were not berserkers. They were leaders, strategists, and politicians. They controlled their rage. They used it when needed, but they never let it control them. That is the real lesson of the berserker myth. Fury can win a battle, but self-control wins an empire. So the next time you see a movie or a video game with a shirtless Viking screaming and biting his shield, remember this: you are watching a myth. A beautiful, terrifying, 1,000-year-old myth. But behind that myth, buried in the soil of Scandinavia, hidden in the silver amulets and the sagas and the Arab travelogues, there is a kernel of truth. Real men once stood on real battlefields, wearing bearskins, howling at the sky, and charging into certain death as if they were invincible. Were they mad? Were they drugged? Were they touched by the gods? We will never know for certain, but we know this: their enemies ran, their enemies screamed, their enemies told stories about them for 1,000 years, and that, in the end, is the only immortality a warrior can ever hope for. Fury unleashed, myth and reality twisted together like the strands of a Viking rope. The berserker lives on, not in history books, not in museums, but in that dark corner of every human mind where we secretly wonder what it would feel like to lose all control, to feel no pain, to be utterly, terrifyingly free. Do not go there, but do not forget that others did. This is the story of the Viking Berserkers, the men who became beasts, the myth that refuses to die.